Chris Adena with American Outdoor News. I'm here with Maria Davidson from Safari Club International. Maria, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I know we have a lot to get into here, especially the recent Florida bear hunt. I know, it's been talked about a great deal. What can you tell me about why a regulated bear hunt in Florida was so important?
Well, Chris, the reason a regulated bear hunt is important in Florida is the same as why it is important anywhere. There is a finite amount of resources, meaning space, food availability, that sort of thing, available to any and all species now. There is only a limited amount available, so there's going to be a limited number of individuals within any population that can thrive on a landscape. And it's the management authority, and in the U.S., those are the state agencies that do their population studies to determine what those numbers are. And then they work to balance them with the other uses on that landscape. Meaning they work to balance them with the other populations that exist on that landscape.
Yep. We have that issue here where I am with whitetail.
Sure.
The land and food sources, as the herds grow, they have to move with where the food is. It's
right.
Pretty self-explanatory.
Right. It's the old, there's a carrying capacity. People tend to know what that means and generally accept that thought when it comes to ungulate species or other game species, meaning deer or elk or turkey. But for some reason or another, carnivores, and specifically bears, tend to draw out this emotion in people that they put all of that to the side to somehow want to just save that species as opposed to manage it. And, what we're seeing in the U.S. is the southern and some of the eastern states that have recovered a bear population, that thought shift from recovery to management has been somewhat of a difficult social shift to make.
Yes.
It's necessary, but it's been a bit difficult.
Well, how does that fit into the broader wildlife plan in Florida? Does setting a set number of permits for bear reflect on some of the other species?
I don't believe that to be the case. Right now, Florida was focusing on using real data, science-backed data, to support their population estimates. They pretty much knew where they felt like they were saturated, and there's different indices that can tell you that. If a population is continuing to expand into other areas, what that tells you as a bear biologist is those core areas are likely saturated, therefore dispersing individuals occur at a growing rate because there's no room in the interior of the core, so they move outside of that core to expand the entire population range. So given the fact that that range expansion, the habitat itself, is limited in Florida, just as it is in other states, there's going to be a limited number of bears it can support. So once the state agency got those base numbers, and, I don't want there to be any mistake, Florida used state-of-the-art science to determine their population numbers. And not only did they conduct it in all of those areas, but then they created a plan to come back to those areas. I've seen many arguments that said that their data was old, that their science was old. And that's, in fact, absolutely not true. Bear population surveys are not conducted on an annual basis. Once you go through that process and you get your density and your abundance, the general mind thought is that you come back after 2 generations, maybe 3 generations, and then you conduct it again. So they
Uh-huh.
are right on track. They're using current data. They are using literally the state-of-the-art data to get a density and abundance for bear populations. And in using that, they were able to determine, because bears are harvested nationwide, in most of the states they exist,
Yep.
they know that they can harvest a certain percentage of that population, and they know which harvest level will produce different results, meaning it will slow the growth or stabilize the growth or decrease it.
Yep.
And so that's what they're working towards in Florida.
And the data that they took into account to authorize X amount of permits, yeah, it's not just the population, it's the habitat capacity, it's the human bear encounter numbers. There's a lot of things that the DEP, DEC take into account before they can authorize something like this, correct?
Well, sure. They start out with some pretty base elements of a genetic survey that, used in combination of movement data from collars, they can create this spatially explicit model that predicts how many bears are within that study area. And then from that, they can, through their den checks, their reproductive checks, things like that, they can predict the population growth for those individual areas. Mm-hmm. And then from that, they of course decide, based on what they're seeing on a day-to-day basis in real life, what they want to do. They feel like they want to stabilize that. Yeah. I think there's an erroneous thought process that a healthy bear population is forever growing. It's never big enough, and that's just not true. And it's a good thing it's not true, because there are states that are only big enough for a few thousand bears. Louisiana being one of those. I worked for many years in Louisiana, and it just successfully had its second bear hunt after it was delisted. So just because a population is small doesn't necessarily mean it's teetering on the brink.
Yep.
It can be perfectly sustainable. It can be perfectly genetically healthy and still sustain a harvest to keep them within a certain parameter.
Yep. And just to put it in comparison, where I am in New York, I grew up going out in the woods. I never saw a bear, ever, until about 15, 18 years ago. No, they're everywhere. I had a club where we took more bear than deer off the property.
I'm not surprised. This place in time where we are, where many states are shifting from recovery to management,
yep,
they have more in common with each other than they have differences. We really were thinking that it was going to take, I think, longer. But if you look back, it's taken a bit. This didn't happen overnight. This happened because of the collective work of state agencies, federal agencies, private landowners played a pivotal role in this, in allowing bears, to utilize their habitat undisturbed. So, bear numbers have rebounded across the country.
Well, from the numbers that were taken in Florida, what kind of data was taken out of that, the health and sustainability of the bear in Florida?
Of the population as a whole, or harvested individuals?
The population of a whole. Usually from you take X amount of bear, you can determine the health and growth of that particular species, correct?
What they did initially was they conducted hair snare projects, and from the hair snare projects, it's very typical of other states that are doing this as well. You go in and you genetically identify individual bears, and then after you do that, you also simultaneously conduct trapping efforts and put collars on female bears, because female animals are the driver of the health of the population, right?
Yes.
So once you begin to track those movements and the reproductive health, the sustainability, the survivability of not only the female but her litter, You can look at the population growth with that. If you go back to the hair snare and you enter that data into some statistical models, then you can create models that can tell you within what certainty the population is within this range. So it's what people colloquially just a population estimate. So once you have the population estimate and the percentage growth, it gives you an idea of where you're going to be 5 years from now and 10 years from now. So they collected not only movement data, reproductive data, and genetic data to create this more holistic story about the individual areas. And they didn't just do this statewide broad brush thing. They conducted individual research in the individual areas and then customized the hunt to match those areas for the specific need to the area.
It's split up into zones. The population may be greater in one section or one zone as opposed to another zone.
Right. Each zone has its own individual unique influencers that can drive the management strategies for FWC. And it also allows the state agency to be very adaptive and able to be quick to respond to changes. The best example of that was the northern population, where they reduced the tags based on the most recent data. That is adaptive management. That is how it is supposed to work, and I applaud the job that FWC did with this.
Well, we see that with like I said, I'm in New York. During whitetail season, you get your buck tag, and then you apply for a doe tag. It doesn't mean you're going to get a doe tag. There's only X amount that they're giving out depending on the zone. So comparatively, that's pretty much how it works, correct?
Well, exactly. And as long as you are collecting all the data necessary, and they did this year, FWC put hands on every bear that was harvested. It allows them to integrate all that data into one and then make a plan for the future. So they can adapt all of that into their strategies for 2026 and determine what tag allotment is appropriate for their management objectives. You know, a hunt plan for bears or anything else needs to have a plan where you're trying to go. If you just leave the house and get in your car and drive away and you don't know where you're going, you're going to run in circles. So if you've got individual population goals, then you know where you're trying to get, and then you collect the data in order to inform your decisions so that you successfully achieve that goal.
So I know the numbers that they pulled are still pretty fresh, and they really haven't had time to really delve into the data from the numbers that were taken. Do you anticipate a bigger season next year for Florida, or is it too early to tell?
I think it's too early to tell because, you know, the number of bears harvested is only one piece of data, right? It doesn't give you the whole story. For example, what influenced that number? You know, I've heard a lot of people say that it was a failure, that it didn't go well, and I just disagree with that because you're only looking at one part of the story. There's many reasons or there's many things that contribute to hunter success. As you know, as a deer hunter, you know, maybe there was just a bumper crop of natural foods. You know, a bumper crop of acorns can disperse animals across the landscape in such a way that they're not drawn to bait, that they have greater flexibility of when they forage. You know, it can draw them into being more nocturnal because they have so much food available to them. Yeah. Weather can play a part in that. And then the individual hunters, of course, play a part. In a hunt structure like this one, where it's not just tags issued or a hunting license sold across the state, you know, there's only a set number of people that were out there attempting to pursue a bear. And let's face it, you know, I don't hunt near as much as I would like to. You know, I drew an elk tag in Wyoming this year, and I only hunted a small handful of times because life gets in the way. You know, you have other things. So until you can look at other data points, meaning, you know, hunter effort, how much hunter effort went into 52 bears? If
Yeah.
not much effort went into it, that's a totally different story than a huge amount of hunter effort, meaning many, many hunter days spent in the field. So it's not the whole story. It's difficult to draw conclusions because of how many different things can play into hunter success. But
Well,
at some point, you are correct. It'll balance out.
yeah.
FWC will have that population goal and objective they're trying to reach, and then they will look at all of the incoming data and then decide on the number of tags in order to reach their goal.
Yeah. And, for the same token that you could be out in the field and see a bear, it doesn't mean that you have a shooting opportunity.
That's correct. You might not have a shooting opportunity. You may see 4 bears, and all 4 bears not be an animal you choose to harvest. Again, there are so many different things that factor into hunter success. Without knowing more information, there's really no conclusions to draw.
Yeah. And, I've sat in my stand and I've seen a big sow come into view, and seconds later, along come 2 cubs.
Right.
I'm not going to take that shot, and I know probably 80% of the other hunters out there wouldn't take the shot as well.
Right. There's lots of reasons why somebody would choose not to pull the trigger on any individual animal. And again, without knowing the rest of the data, you just you can't paint a full story about what happened there.
There's a lot
But
more.
I think it's really important, Chris, to applaud FWC in putting this together in a very regimented, straightforward, biologically sound manner, and just sticking to their guns, knowing what their population needed, doing what it took in order to reach that goal, and then carrying it through. Because as you saw, there was a lot of pushback from this anti-hunting group that is pretty outspoken in Florida. And I've been really surprised at some of the things that have come out, because the disinformation and the misinformation campaign is real and surprising to me, I guess.
Well, these anti-hunting groups, I would like their data on how much money that they raise goes back into conservation as much as we put into conservation. I know that the comparison, it would probably pale in comparison to what we do.
I agree, it does. And I feel this real sense of unfairness when I do believe that wildlife and the outdoors and wild lands and wild places, they are out there for everybody to enjoy. And I don't tell them how to enjoy it. I think they should be allowed to go out there. I think they should be allowed to view bears, camp, hike, photograph bears. I think they should be allowed to do that. But I don't think they should be allowed to say that we don't get to go out and enjoy our wildlife in the way we see fit. And what we enjoy is hunting. And hunting is a critical and serious component to conservation and wildlife management. So it's a weird thing to me, and a sense of unfairness that they want to infringe upon our rights, while I don't see it the other way at all. I don't see anybody telling them they can't do that, they can't go out and enjoy wildlife.
Well, there's a huge misconception about being a hunter. I think it's a wondrous experience to be sitting in your stand, watching the sunrise, watching the woods come to life. You learn something every time you're out there. Any number of species, whatever it may be, turkey, squirrels, whitetail, bear. You're watching it all. It doesn't mean you're going to shoot something every time you're out there. Being out there and enjoying nature, that's a big part of it.
Oh, I agree. And the hunters I know, and myself included, that's the biggest part of it. The actual pulling the trigger on the individual animal that we've chosen to harvest that day is not necessarily the end goal. That's not all I wanted to accomplish that day. And I also think that they don't truly believe the appreciation we have for wildlife and nature and wild places and the level of responsibility we feel in conserving those areas and that wildlife. Because if you look across the country, all hunted species enjoy a serious conservation effort, in the United States. And you do not see hunted species throughout the United States in a serious decline. They're measured, they're monitored closely. If there's any issues, they cut back on tags. When there's a number of them, they increase tags. So they enjoy a level of management and attention that truly unhunted species don't always enjoy.
It's true. It's true.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, as we said, there's a huge misconception to what we do, whether it be bear or whitetail or turkey or waterfowl, upland game, whatever the case may be. What would be the message that you would like to convey to keep these people more informed?
I've thought about that a lot. I'm interested that you asked that question, because I think it's a common thing that many of us think about and wonder about. And to be honest, Chris, I don't know, because I'm not sure it's about education. I think they are so dead set against hunting that they depict it in such an untrue light that I'm not sure sometimes I see an open mind enough to hear us, to hear what the message is. I had a meeting on this topic just earlier today, and one of the things that we wanted to do was to clearly describe through white papers and have you the impact that hunting has on conservation in individual states. When you look at individual states and the amount of money spent managing species, the amount of money spent managing game species far exceeds non-game.
Sure.
The amount of attention spent on game species far exceeds non-game. The amount of attention from private landowners wanting to improve the habitat on their properties for game far exceeds non-game. So I think if they were willing to hear, I think if they were willing to sit at a table and truly hear us, that's what I would try to convey. I think it's important for us to remember that the truly outspoken is the small majority. I really believe that. There is a huge 80% in the middle that while there may be non-hunters, they're not anti-hunters. And I think it's incumbent upon us, upon me, upon you to speak to that group and explain why hunting is such a critical part of conservation. We don't exist back in the turn of the century. Habitat is not an infinite resource. It is finite. It exists at a particular finite level. And, the wildlife that lives on it now must exist at a particular finite level in order to thrive.
Yep, 100%. 100%. And if I was sitting having a conversation with Mona Lisa Vito, I would tell her that I wear Sitka-colored pants when I shoot a deer.
There you go.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. You've clarified so much information that people need to know about why they finally came up with a Florida hunt. I think Connecticut will be not far behind that.
I agree.
Everything needs to be managed. Look at New Jersey. New Jersey went for so long where you couldn't let your kids go out in the backyard without fear of a bear coming into the backyard while your kids are playing back there.
I agree.
It's necessary. It's not a rabbit. Rabbits are all over. They're not going to attack your kids.
I agree, and our hope is that these states that have these growing bear populations, where the state agency has decided, okay, it's time we manage with some type of limited hunt, I think that if there's a role for us, the role for us is to be leaders in that conversation about why we support our state agencies. That's what they're there to do. That is their job, and generally they're really good at it.
They are. They are. And again, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. We are running out of time, but where can we find you and any more information about conservation?
Well, we have an SCI website that is available. There's also Safari Club International Foundation, which is where all of our biologists are housed. We have plenty of information on there. I would also suggest that they go to the FWC website. I don't know if you've spent any time on their website, but it's a really good one, and they go to great lengths to explain the wheres and the whys of what they did and how they did it and why they did it. So I think that's a great resource for the Florida people.
Yeah. You can also go to National Shooting Sports Foundation. They have a wealth of information.
100%.
Just on money raised. The money goes to different conservation and how it's spent, jobs it creates. It's really amazing the amount of revenue our industry generates and is put to good use.
I agree.
All right. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
See you soon.
We love our children. We protect them. We guide them. We prepare them for life in the world. With all that we do, from deep in our hearts, we cannot control all things. Life-threatening illnesses and disabilities affect far too many of our children each year. While we cannot change the circumstance, we can make dreams come true. Dreams to provide hope, to provide spiritual healing and strength, to provide moments of happiness and relief in the hardest of times. We can give a glimmer of light and hope in a time of darkness and despair. Join huntofalifetime.org to help make dreams come true, to provide hope for children with life-threatening illnesses and disabilities. Hunt of a Lifetime is a non-profit organization fulfilling dreams for hunting and fishing trips to youth 21 and under with life-threatening illnesses and disabilities. Visit huntofalifetime.org to learn how you can make a difference.